Okay. When me and Andy came together to talk about battle reports, it reminded me a bit about things that I'd worked on over the years that weren't actually games or scenario packs or products as such. And it kind of made me think a bit about a question that I often get asked is what are you most proud of in the things that you've done over the years? And almost inevitably I'll think about games. So I'll say Blood Bowl or this particular codex or this game system or Warhammer Ancient Battles or something like that, all of which I'm very proud of. But there are other things that I did that I'm proud of too, and that's really what I'd like to talk about here. And there are kind of like three of them. There's J-files, articles, which then morphed into Standard Bearer later on. There's grand tournaments that I helped to set up, and the effect that sort of had going on. And finally, and similarly, there's the worldwide campaigns, the global campaigns that Games Workshop ran, which I set up the first one for. And I think that all three of those things, they kind of like have a common thread, and that they're looking at community and bringing people together rather than actually designing a product, because hobby is as much about the community of people that play it as it is about the actual things themselves. We're all interested in the same kind of thing. So I was going to talk a bit about those basically, one after the other, and see where we...
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll start off with J-files, which is kind of like a good starting point, I think, because that followed on quite naturally from writing the battle reports. So when Andy and I were talking about battle reports, I think I said that it's where I started to learn how to write articles that weren't rule books. I started writing things that weren't actually the rules for games, because the standard battle report articles would need like an intro and an outro. And I started to develop a kind of like a style of writing, but more importantly, I started to get interested in talking about things to do with the hobby that weren't necessarily specifically to do with the rules of the games. I must admit, I can't remember what exactly it was the very first J-files article that I ended up designing. If you could find it, that would be cool. But there would be something that I'd have got a bit of bee in my bonnet about. And what I remember, and I should say with all of these things, these are my memories, so I'll have forgotten things, I'll be misremembering some stuff, but this is how I remember things happening. What I remember was going to see Robin Dews and saying that I've had this idea for an article, but it's not really an article that ties in with the game. It's about me rambling on a bit about something to do with the hobby. And Robin was like, cool, that's cool. I said, that sounds interesting, let's go for it, basically. And that was the first J-files article. I called it J-files just because we needed to give things a name. I think by that stage we'd got Blanchitsu already kind of like in the magazine, but that was mainly kind of artwork and photography. So I thought, well, I've got to come up with a name, and I love the X-Files. Yeah, it's just a great series. Yeah. In fact, just funnily enough, I've come across it again on one of the streaming channels and thinking, I could watch that again, actually, that would be fun. So I thought, well, I'll call it J-files. And I started writing articles. What I did was, I think in the battle reports video that we did, I talked a bit about a chap called Charles Grant. Charles Grant is my favourite historical war games rules writer. Well, he wrote lots of articles and battle reports and all kinds of things. And his set of rules, Battle Practical Wargaming, were the first set of rules I ever played. And the rules were actually written as a series of magazine articles, and they talked a lot about, like how to go about things, and it wasn't just the rules on the page, it was about how the hobby worked as much as anything. So he was inspiring, and I sort of like, I channeled my inner Charles Grant for those early articles, and you'll kind of like see, he's a bit like a rather old-fashioned 1950s sort of like paternal uncle or something like that is the way that he talks. And those early articles, that's the way that I used to write them too. So they were quite kind of like chatty, rather old-fashioned. So I'd start to, and I deliberately wrote them in a kind of like a very rambling sort of way. I didn't want them to be too precise and things. And over the years, I had quite a few sort of like little fights with editors who would be sort of say, well, you're just kind of like, what's the point of this? You're just wittering on about something or getting completely sidetracked. And I said, well, that's just the way these articles work. That's
it's your personality kind of coming through.
That's right. And I think that's your personality coming through is an interesting point, I think, because I know that people have read those, have read J files and then later on Standard Bearer, and that they've got those articles. They've created. I've got like it's a created persona. It's the kind of hobby bit of my personality, if that makes sense. Sure. So the real me is a bit different to the way that I present myself in those articles, and I definitely created a kind of almost like a persona as I was going along about the way that I'd address things and the kind of things that I'd talk about, which was an interesting experience to go through, because then people meet you and they obviously think you know you quite well.
They have this assumption of who you are.
Yeah, exactly, and it's not quite actually me. But I mean, that being said, I think that it was a really worthwhile thing to do, because it started to talk about things to do with the hobby that couldn't really be addressed anywhere else. And I think that if I look around the hobby at the moment, one of the things that I think is a little bit sad is that there aren't more things like that going on, where people, rather than kind of like just doing a battle report or doing here's how to win with this army or something like that, they talk about things like a gamer's love-hate relationship with dice, what it's like to, how to cope with losing games, and the social contract that goes on there, all different kind of aspects to do with stuff, how like the importance of the collecting hobby, about collecting things, and like building an army up and stuff. So I started writing those articles, and then they proved to be quite popular. They were regular. I didn't have to do them every month. It was just if I'd got something to write about. And then Andy joined in, so he did Chambers of the Horned Rat, and then of course there's Stillmania. Nigel Stillman's like glorious, and that, I have to say, with Nigel's articles, you really get Nigel on the page there. It's the way that they present is exactly the way that Nigel is, I would say. Yeah. So it generated a little kind of like sort of almost like a new type of article that started appearing in White Dwarf magazine, which I think was really, it benefited the magazine, and nowadays there haven't really been terribly many articles like that for quite a while, which I think is kind of like, it's an interesting segue into J files turning into Standard Bearer, because at the time that Standard Bearer started, that wasn't something that I said I'd like to write these things. I'd been running Fnatic and had written kind of like stuff that, so the Specialist Games division. Then Specialist Games got shut down, which is a whole story in and of itself, which I won't go into terribly much, but it meant that I came back to the main studio, and I was asked to do some articles like Standard Bearer, but I had to do them, like J files, but they wanted one every month. So I started writing those, and that was a whole different experience. That really was. I mean, it was. I think that I did a good job, and that they didn't become too much about. They started off. They wanted to be focused. The request was that they be focused on new things that were coming out, and in the end, I managed to convince people that was a bit of a blind alley, really, because there was plenty of stuff in White Dwarf magazine and everywhere else talking about the new things that were coming out. So me talking about the new things that were coming out as well, it just didn't really help terribly much. So I was able to kind of like get it back to being more like the J-Files articles used to be and talk about things. But trying to do that sort of 12 times a year, and finding, it was a lot of stuff to do, and I got the most terrible writer's block, so I'd always be working, like leaving it till just the last minute, and then like work at home for a day and just kind of like get it down. I learned how to kind of like come up with a system that helped me write those things. It would take me a month to figure out what I was going to do, and then a day to get it written. But it proved to be quite hard work, really. So when I retired, one of the things I was quite happy about was not having to do any more standard bearer articles in the end. So weirdly, it became almost like a bit of a burden in the long run. Yeah. But those early articles I think were really good when it was J files, and there are quite a few of the standard bearer articles themselves I actually really like, because I was desperately scrabbling around for stuff. So that was the one where talking about dice came from, because I think I'd come across something on the internet with somebody, I thought it was just brilliant. If one of their dice did particularly badly, if they got a dice that kept rolling ones, whatever it might be, and they noticed it, what they'd do is they'd get all of their other dice and put them out, and then they'd get the one dice that was doing badly and they'd cover it with lighter fluid and burn it in front of all of the other dice, and they'd say, look, that's what's going to happen to you if you don't end up. And I think almost every wargamer kind of, understands
Everyone
that.
goes through a period of bad dice rolls in multiple games,
Tell me about it. Tell me about it. So, yes, yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, that is something that people in the community would have experienced, and being able to see someone like yourself write that and go, oh yeah, like look, it's not just me, it's, and you mentioned community at the start when you started filming that, as a fan, it really, builds that sense of community that even the experts, even the pros, go through the same thing as, the amateurs.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's a thin line really between it's your hobby that you've turned into a job. Basically, when you're working on these things, you've got to be a hobbyist first, and then you kind of like, you learn skills, and it changes your relationship to games. So I'm still a hobbyist. I play all kinds of games, but Games Workshop games, I think that. I think it's important to understand that I was working at Games Workshop when Warhammer came out. So my entire relationship with Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 has been a product that made by the company where I worked. Blood Bowl the same. It just changes things a bit, basically, because you have to be professional about it. So what you do is you take your own hobby kind of interests and you start to see whether you can kind of whether there are valuable things there that can be applied to what you're doing for Games Workshop. And there won't always be, because I'm particularly, towards the end of my career, I've been I was 50, 60 years old, and I've been playing these games for a very long time. So what I was looking for in a game would be very different from what somebody who's just starting out in the hobby would be. And in addition, my relationship to Warhammer and 40k wasn't ever as a hobbyist. So the historical war games rules that I write and things like that, they're a bit more hobby for me, because they were games that I was actually playing. That being said, I was playing fantasy and science fiction games as well before I joined Games Workshop, so it was in part of it, but the relationship's a bit different. But going back to those early J files articles, so they worked out well, and they kind of lit a little bit of a fire under me, really. And so I started thinking about, well, there could be other things like this. And that kind of leads me on to the second bit of this, which is the grand tournaments. So, because there's a relationship between J files and grand tournaments. So, basically, at the time, the games designers would be invited to quite a few shows. So we'd go to America quite often, to American Games Days, and other events that were held over there, Canadian Games Days and various other things. One of the things that and obviously we go to Games Day in the UK as well. So Games Day's got a tradition, but what I found was that I liked going to Baltimore Games Day rather more than the UK Games Day, mainly because it was 3 days long. So 2 days, I think actually it was. But it was much longer, and there weren't as many people there at that time. That might be different now. And what I'd get would be a chance to talk to people, basically, that you'd really hang out with people. So I started to realise that there was a difference between Games Day UK and Games Day US. Games Day UK, it felt to me, was an exhibition. That it was quite short, it was about 6 hours long, and people would turn up, look at things, maybe get a chance for a brief chat with some of the games designers, look at demo games and things like that, go to the stalls to buy things and then go away and go home. Whereas the US Games Day felt more like a convention, if that makes sense. So you've got a whole bunch of people are hanging out in the same kind of place. Yeah. Sorry, my phone just made a noise. Yeah, okay. So the experience of it was very different. And as I say, I thought, well, yeah, I rather enjoy the, like hanging out with hobbyists because I get a proper chance to talk to them about things in a way that's quite difficult to do at Games Day, because at Games Day you're just signing things and people you get like a minute or two basically. Sure. But so I thought, oh, I'd quite like to do something. Maybe I could organise something myself, and that was really, actually, that was the starting point for the grand tournaments. It wasn't really a burning desire on my part to create a really good tournament system. It was, well, how can I trap a group of hobbyists with me where basically they can't get away? Because there won't be too many of them, so we can have proper chats about the hobby and what they want, what they like, and I can sort of like see the games actually going on. So I thought, well, a tournament might work for that. But at that time, there weren't very many tournaments being run for Warhammer.
What time period this was?
This would have been the early 90s, so around about 92, I would guess, 92, 93.
Sure.
I was starting, I'd been doing the J-Files articles, I'd got Blood Bowl 3rd edition, I think was around about that time too. So I think in my mind, that was when I started to really kind of like become kind of like a reasonably experienced games designer, but also I was starting to kind of like get more of a feel for kind of like other things that we could be doing
beyond game design.
Beyond the games design, but related to it.
Yeah, sure.
So I thought, well, at that time, as I say, there weren't very many Warhammer tournaments being written. On the historical gaming side, there was a long tradition going back to the early 60s of tournament play, but it had a relatively bad reputation at the time, and to an extent you still get that nowadays, where people think that people who go to tournaments just want to win. Sure. They win at all costs, whack. That kind of subverts the game and makes it an unpleasant experience.
Yeah, it's not in the spirit of the game.
Exactly. And particularly back then, the Warhammer rules and the 40k rules weren't tightly written in the way that they are generally nowadays. So I thought, well, what if I organised a tournament, but I made it a bit more than just coming along to win games? So I thought I could say that you get points for sportsmanship, so it'd be nice, basically. So you get points for winning games, you get points for sportsmanship, and I thought, and having a nicely painted army, that's an important part of the hobby, so you get points for that too. And at that time, this is one that didn't really stand the test of time. Knowing the background, so I thought I could do a little quiz, like a multiple, like asking questions about the background, and you get points for that too. So it was all of those different aspects. I've got a feeling there was another one as well, but it's just kind of like, no, maybe it was just those four. But these different aspects of them would all score you different points, and they'd all get added together, and that would determine the winner. Yeah. So I went to Robin again, and I said, like, I've got this idea I think might be rather cool for running like a little kind of a tournament. The problem is that it'll cost us some money, to do it. What I can promise is that Games Workshop won't lose money in the end. If you just let me have the money, then I'll organise the tournament and I'll get all the money back again. So Robin, again, bless him, said, yeah, sure, Jervis, you can knock yourself out. So off I went and organised the first of the grand tournaments. And I wrote about it in J-Files. So that was what I did. I used J-Files to kind of put my stall out, basically, and explain why the tournament system was different to the ones that had gone before, and the importance of it being about kind of celebrating all of the hobby, not just your ability to win.
Rather than win at all costs.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, well, the article was more about how the format of the system, and really trying to say that this isn't. It's not about winning at all costs. It's about celebrating all of the hobby, all of the different aspects of the hobby. And I went to Nottingham University, and I found out that they've got great facilities there, and that if I did it in the summer holidays, if I held the tournament in the summer holidays, they got accommodation as well, and a food hall. So basic, and so I'm planning on trapping people there for the weekend. So the very first grand tournament, you could buy tickets for it, but what the ticket got you was your room and your food. And basically the tournament was free, so you had to come and stay on campus. You couldn't leave, and you had to eat anything. Otherwise, you didn't have to, but you'd be crazy if not to, basically. And then I went round, and I got a lot of support from within Games Workshop. In particular, a chap called Ed Spettigue and a chap called Gordon Davidson, who ran the mail order department at the time, really got behind me and basically volunteered all of their stuff, because I couldn't pay anybody any wages. So everybody who was going to be working there from Games Workshop, including myself, was basically doing it for food, drink, and a t-shirt. That was the other thing. A really, really nice t-shirt, I decided, would be a cool thing. So I remember the very first t-shirt, I got the best quality t-shirts that I could for the staff. And I hate things with big logos on, so it had little, rather tiny, rather kind of little cool, as I considered it, a t-shirt. So everybody got free t-shirts, and their food and their drink. The mail order staff really pitched in, and they got the table. You had to get loads of tables and paint them green and make all of the scenery, send out the packs. And respond to people who got in touch, but it worked basically. People turned up, not quite as many as I'd hoped. I think I was aiming for 250, and I think I managed to get like 150 in the end, which I realised with hindsight was bloody well good going actually, because it was one of the biggest tournaments that had ever been held anywhere. And then the other things that I did was that I made we had a games library of our other games, so that if people had some downtime, they could go into this room and play board games and other things from Games Workshop. I organised seminars, so I roped in people from around and about to come and do things and talk about stuff. And we did a pub quiz on the Saturday night, and a charity auction, basically. So we did all kinds of things. And then at the very, very end, we got everybody together and we took a big group photograph of everybody, which got posted. So you got your results posted too, because this is all pre-internet, really. And it proved enough of a hit to kind of like, so that was, the first one was for Warhammer, then we did one for 40k, and then I organised several more over the years, and it kind of like just established that kind of organised play format as being part of the hobby.
Part of the community.
Exactly, not for everybody, because not everybody wants to go to things like that. They can they can get intimidated by the thought of playing games competitively. But I think that when you look around at a lot of stuff that's going on now, I can see kind of like there's little roots that trace back to those things. So you had things like the ETC, until a few years ago when Age of Sigmar came out, the ETC sort of imploded. But up until then, I mean, you've got these amazingly kind of big, organised, very, very serious things, lots of different formats. They generally will, as time's gone along, a lot of the things that I considered important have tended to kind of like get filed off. So quite a lot of tournaments will concentrate on playing to win. They won't have all of the extra stuff that I always considered to be rather important. But then my ambition was a bit different. I didn't just want to run a tournament. I was interested in getting people together. So for me, the best night was always the Saturday night, because I get quite drunk generally, and chat to people. I got to know a chap called Rob Groom, who set up the Warhammer Players Society, which were a big thing back in the day, and it created all kinds of like cool stuff around. And then showing the legacy. So I mentioned Ed Spettigue and Gordon Davidson. and they, Ed Spettigue ended up moving to Canada, invited me over to the first Canadian Grand Tournament, which he organised, based on, because he'd obviously, he knew how to do it, because he'd been there, kind of like with me, kind of like, and we'd together, like we'd figured out how to do these things, me and Gordon and Ed. Then later on, he moved to Chicago, and one of the things that he did there was that he helped set up Adepticon. So he was basically, and the reason that he did that was that he wanted something a bit like the Grand Tournament scene, system that we'd got to be around. So he managed to convince a group of people there to set up Adepticon, and said that he'd help for the first year or two. I think he was involved in kind of helping. And so Adepticon, the biggest kind of like thing, has it again, you can trace it's kind of like a bit like a rock family tree. Yeah, sure. You can kind of like trace it all the way back to those early Grand Tournaments. So I think in many ways, as an ongoing legacy, probably the Grand Tournament scene that's around, is as much a thing that I'm proud of as I am of Blood Bowl, which again, I think it's interesting because with neither of these things anymore, and for quite a long time, I've not really had anything to do with them directly. Sure. But you kind of like, say, okay, and I think that my instincts were right. It feels like, and I'm proud of what we were able to achieve, and again, it wasn't just me, it was like a whole group of people, and then it was a whole group of people outside of Games Workshop, because I think that in particular things like the Grand Tournaments are very empowering for the community, because they, more often than not, they're run by the community itself, and so you get all of these unique special events that are held in different countries all around the world that reflect the views and attitudes of the people who organise them. So no, it was an interesting thing. The third thing that was like that was the global campaigns. So again, it was a very, very similar thing. So I'd started writing J-files. I'd organised the tournaments, and one of the things that I love doing is I like playing campaigns. So and I still do. Funnily enough, I saw Michael and Alan Perry on Friday, as you do, down at the trip to Jerusalem, and I've got an idea for a campaign. So we were talking about that. So a campaign that we're going to play, the American Civil War rather than Warhammer, but it's pretty much the principles the same. Absolutely. So I love the idea of campaigns, and I know that there are lots of different ways that you can do them. I've never played the same campaign twice, if that makes sense. You're always kind of like reformatting things. But there wasn't terribly much going on with campaigns, and so I was thinking, well, what could we do about that? Obviously we could run a campaign and run it as a series of battle reports, and I can't remember whether before or after that, but we definitely did stuff like that in the battle reports. We did linked up games and the idea of campaigns, and there were campaign systems in the rule books, but I didn't hear very much about it. And again, what I was interested in was kind of like creating community. So I thought, what if I say that we're going to run a campaign through White Dwarf magazine, and people play their games and they send me the results. So I went down to Robin and I said, Robin, I think I've had this good idea, basically. I think absolutely. Well, it was definitely, there's a way I remember it. It was going to Robin saying, I think I've had a good idea. Because I think I must have had some ideas that Robin decided weren't good ideas, basically, and they never came off them. But anyway, and Robin said, yes, no, that sounds cool. Yeah, we can do that. So again, it started out almost like as a J-Files article. So it was like, okay, we're going to run a campaign. And what I did was, I thought, well, I'll do it for 40k. And there's got to be something dramatic going on here. So I thought, well, what if I say, everybody out there, you all play games of 40k and you send the results to me, and I'll split all of the different races up onto 2 different sides. And then we'll count up the number of victories, and whoever gets the most gets to destroy a planet in the galaxy, basically. And that became the battle for Icar 4. So the very first global campaign was there was a world, it was being invaded by the Tyranids, plus everybody else could join in too on each side, basically. So it was a little bit of kind of like stretching the background in rather unlikely ways in order to justify everybody taking part, but that was okay, because everybody knew what was going on. And I wrote about it in a J-Files article and said, okay, it's going to be happening over this period of time. And I got in touch with the people within Games Workshop who run our retail chain, because I know that all of our stores, they organise games and play games in store. So they're always looking for these, particularly over the summer holidays. So I thought, well, if I set this up, it'll run over the summer holidays, UK summer holidays. So it was like a 6-week period when the summer holidays were on. And it meant that if you couldn't play at home or at a club, you could always you could go into the stores and play games there, and they'd help you find opponents. And so the stores were good, they got behind that. I wrote about it in White Dwarf magazine, but again, this was pre-internet. So what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to do this, and our stores will send me data, things back in their weekly reports and stuff like that. But everybody else, you can just write to me. Write me letters, tell me about the games that you've played, tell me the results that happened. And then after the summer holidays have ended, I'll gather all of this information together and I'll write up another article. And that meant that you weren't going to hear about actually what happened for about 2 or 3 months, basically, because you couldn't do it immediately. I had to write it, and then we had to print the magazine, basically, with the actual results in. And it was great fun. It really worked well. I think the ICAR4 didn't get destroyed, did it? I can't remember now actually what the outcome of the actual battle was. But it proved to be very popular, and in particular it did this weird kind of thing where our stores said, well, we want to do more of these because we had the best summer we've ever had, basically, which wasn't an intended consequence of it. And I got all of these letters, and people sent me brilliant stuff. I just got the most fantastic stuff, like artwork, people do drawings, they do a little battle report of their games. So I tried to get as much of that as I could. And so if you track down the issue of White Dwarf that it's in, if you can find it, it's like lots of pictures of the things, and me sitting, I remember the photograph of me sitting surrounded by piles of paper for all the letters that I got. So after that, we decided that we'd do another one. I think we did another one the next year, but the first one had been me, basically, me figuring out it. And the second one, it started to get a little bit more involved, so more people got involved. I think that we figured out that probably we could use the internet to do stuff for that. From the second one on, and then it kept on kind of like going from there. And I think that the problem with it was that it became a bit too much like a product, if that makes sense. It became because it became very organised, and that you needed staff to run the website and create the website and things for the later ones. They became very, very sophisticated compared to write me a letter, I'll count up who've lost most battles. And then in the end, it kind of like it fell over because of that, because it was just too much effort to actually organise it, and each one had to be a bit bigger than the one that came before. So it was like, I started off like saying that a planet might, and then in the end it was like the fate of the galaxy is going to be decided. And so but very occasionally it kind of like it loops back, and I see other people doing things. So it's something that I remember really fondly and that I was proud of again, that I did. And what I particularly liked about, especially the first one, was again, it was just like you could see people doing stuff, playing games, organising things, like with their little group playing their own little campaign. So it kick-started and encouraged people to participate in the hobby themselves. And I guess that's probably a thing for all of those 3 things, actually. In particular, the grand tournaments and the global campaigns, they gave people an opportunity and an excuse, to encourage
meeting like-minded people and getting tips on hobbying skills, painting, whatever. So.
Absolutely, give them an excuse to play games, and just kind of like a bit of a nudge. I suppose, to actually because I think this hobby can be quite insular, and lots of hobbyists are quite shy. Although I don't necessarily present that way, I consider myself like that too. I think that having things that give you a reason to go somewhere, just to finish an army, I think that certainly. I think that what's most amazing about the tournament scene now is that the way that people get armies finished. I think the very first tournament I did, you got points for painting, but you didn't have to bring a painted army. And I think there was something like, out of all of the people who entered, there were like 3 finished armies, because people just didn't finish armies back then.
Sure.
And I can remember what I used to do was at the end of each tournament, I'd get as many players who were still around together, and I'd say, okay, we're going to do a debrief, but rather than you asking me questions, I'm going to ask you questions about stuff. And I can remember I was doing that, and one person in particular said, I think that you shouldn't allow people to have unpainted armies at these tournaments. And the reason for that is that I come here with a fully painted army, and that's as much a sign of respect on my part to my opponent. That I'm trying to put something out there that will be fun and enjoyable to play against.
Immersion, almost, like,
Yeah, but also respect for the other people who are there. And I thought, actually, that's a really good point. So from then, I started saying, no, you have to bring painted armies. You can't turn up here with unpainted miniatures. It's just not allowed. Which caused a little bit of fuss, actually, within the community at the time, because it was so almost unheard of. Everybody tended to have quite a lot of unpainted stuff on the tabletop. But what it did was it kind of like made the tournaments almost like this kind of aspirational kind of like thing, because to take part, you needed a complete painted army, and I think that that's just a great kind of like aspect of them, really, because it shows off the hobby in its best light. And so for me, towards the end, I ran tournaments for quite a while, but towards the end, the bit that I always enjoyed the most was the Armies on Parade for the Best Painted Army Award, basically, where you just get all of these armies out and you could go around and have a look at all of them properly, because it's difficult to do when the armies are actually in the heat of battle. You're just kind of like,
state of mind, aren't you?
Well, yeah, you are, especially if you're running the bloody thing. So it's so actually having a bit of a chance to kind of like decompress and actually look at the cool stuff that was out there and like decide which is the army that I thought was the best was always good fun. So and that's it, really. It's just like there's 3 different kind of like things that I think are important, and I think if you sort of like put a message out there to people, these are all things that anybody who's involved in the hobby can do. You can all write stuff, about the hobby, and present stuff. So if you've got your podcast or your blogs and things like that, good on you, and keep on doing it. And if you don't, then think about it. You can organise tournaments, you can participate in tournaments, and global campaigns are actually quite easy to organise. They don't have to be big, all singing, all dancing Games Workshop style ones. Running a campaign of some form or another is a great thing to do, and it's an important part of the hobby, so go for it.